Okay, welcome everyone to another edition of SpectrumCast, or the Data Resilience SpectrumCast. I am joined, as always, by my co-host, Randy Arsenault, and our subject matter experts, Tricia Jang and Sean Sperry. How are you guys doing today?
Morning.
Morning. This week, we want to talk about large data recovery. So if you think about the fact that as time has moved forward, and we know everybody has a data protection solution or a data resilience solution in their environment, they're storing more and more and more data, and that data can be stored anywhere. It can be stored on tapes, it can be stored on disk, it can be stored in the cloud. Now, all of a sudden, I need to do some form of recovery, and I just have a massive amount of information. In fact, we joke, we like to call this large truck recovery in some instances. So, Tricia, when you start thinking about large capacity recoveries, what's some of the things that come to mind?
First thing that comes to mind is the speeds and the feeds that you're going to get. And this really worries me in the cloud, because when you upload data to the cloud, that might be a totally different speed from when you download it. And that might have to do with, have you tiered it once it reached the cloud into a less expensive, slower cloud pool? And so that goes back to what Randy's always joking that I say, but test, 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 because it's not only the slowness, but it's the cost. And how much is that going to cost you to pull it out of the cloud?
I venerate your test, test, test mantra, because it's super important. And by the way, I've kind of started doing it myself with my local backup and recovery. So thank you.
Sean, what's some of the things that come to your mind when you think about this large system recovery?
Well, again, it sounds like we almost hit the same themes every week, right? For Tricia's test, test, test. For me, it's planning, planning, planning. And you always talk about data classification, right? When we talk about having large amounts of data, I think it's true we have more data than we ever have, but that makes the classification of that data more important. And which of it do you need to do this actual recovery? Do you need it all, or do you need some subset of it? And that comes down to planning, right? Or to classifying the data and planning how you're going to get that data back.
As you guys know, I'm just, for whatever reason, I'm fascinated by truck mode. Like, I just love the idea of a giant truck full of tapes, like leaving Iron Mountain and pulling out and, showing up to your remote data center and doing a massive restore, which probably doesn't happen very often these days, I would imagine. But how do you balance the cost and time required and the planning and the testing and all the moving parts with the probability that you're going to have to do that kind of a large scale instantaneous recovery, and B, that it's even possible, like given the volume of data that we're dealing with now, and the fact that, an enterprise, if you do have some kind of a massive disruption of service and a loss of a data center or something, is it practical to do this? I mean, can you simulate it? Are there ways that you can understand what's going to be involved in the unlikely event that some horrible disaster takes place? Like, how do you even begin with something like this?
Well, I think there's a couple of things you got to consider when we talk about disasters. There's so many different types of disasters, and it really depends on, are we talking you just lost one of your application servers that needs to be restored, your file server, your database? Or are we talking about you actually lost your backup server also? And so now we got to rebuild that backup server before we can restore the databases and applications. And then we're asking ourselves, well, where are these entities running? Is everything in the cloud, your backup server and your data? And I know we've had this cloud discussion before on how you can run your Spectrum Protect server and Spectrum Protect Plus server up there. You can have your data stored there. So we have a lot, and we can be protecting the applications up there. So your truck mode becomes really interesting, because now what are we, even if it's up in the cloud, is the cloud provider going to have to cut tapes and send them to you because it's such massive amounts of data? Or are you going to have to pull part of your backup, maybe your Spectrum Protect Plus server backup from Iron Mountain, but your data backup is in the cloud? So maybe there's going to be trucks coming from all over the place.
I think it comes down to it's everything, right? It's testing, it's classification, it's planning. I think we're all astute now that 100% of clients these days traditionally have a data protection solution. And I would say upwards of 80% of those have multiple backup solutions for a variety of different reasons. Some wanted to back up a particular application with a particular solution. Sometimes people change jobs in a company and the new person that comes in wants to try something different. Regardless, if you're classifying your data, we should now start thinking about classifying your application, classifying the applications that actually bring data back, bring the data that drives the business back first. How much of that is there? Where should it be stored? And then follow that up with, okay, let's test that particular process, right? So I've got one entity that is a small amount of data, or maybe it's a medium amount of data, but that's the most important data. Where does it make sense to store that information? And then I've got this other data set that might be a much larger data set, which isn't as critical to recover. Where do I put that data set? Maybe that is the cloud. Maybe it is tape. Maybe 24 hours or greater are okay for that information. And then the tools that live inside of these applications, such as tiering, right? With Spectrum Protect, you can tier data and you can tier it in the cloud. So if all of a sudden that data is now 30, 60, 90 days old and it's tiered to cold storage, and I have to do a recovery, what are the SLAs that the cloud provider provides to you, right? They might not be able to get off of cold storage onto some type of storage to either A, Tricia, as you said, put it on tape, or B, just get it back to you for 24 or 36 hours, whatever it might be, right? So there's a lot of different things. And then the applications themselves, Protect Plus, that near instantaneous recovery. You're going to start thinking about these tools that are available to you to help you meet your business SLAs.
Yeah. And I think part of the thing too is those tools and the mechanics of how you use them has changed throughout the years, right? I mean, it is a totally different world than it was 3 to 4 years ago or 5 years ago. So if you've done your planning and done your thinking about this 4 to 5 years ago, it's time to go back and revisit what you've done and perhaps look at different solutions like the cloud or those new technologies that you mentioned.
So
Steve.
It sounds like, geez, we just went from like possibly an entire fleet of trucks to no trucks. That's kind of bumming me out, but thanks for raining on my truck parade.
I would also say too, the disasters that you are planning for or the incidents that you are planning for have drastically changed over the last 3 to 5 years, right? I mean, when we talked about disaster recovery 3 years ago, even, we were basically talking about site loss, right? We were talking about my data center gets blown up, my data center floods, natural disaster, things like that. These days, cyber attacks is playing more and more into that thinking where the physical facilities are still available, right? But the only thing that has been lost is the IT data or the IT equipment. Or access to it, shall we say?
Does that imply so first of all, that it sounds kind of complicated. So I want to delve into that a little bit more. But it also sounds like maybe the wholesale recovery of a full site, for example, and everything on it is far less likely maybe than it was in the past. It seems like it's more of a targeted tactical recovery now. That's like Steve said, you can kind of lay it out on a time continuum instead of doing a critical mass.
I don't know that part is less likely. I think the IT recovery is more likely. The cyber incident is more likely. I think your risks have gone up.
Okay. So it's a net increase across the board. I got you. Okay.
Yeah,
that makes sense.
It's just that you're dealing with an additional potential hazard. Now that's very real.
And one thing I see is a lot of customers doing is because of this increase in hazard, they now have 2 copies. So maybe they have a copy out on the cloud, but they also still have a copy in Iron Mountain. And so that then becomes the question of, okay, we've got a disaster. Where can we be pulling it 2 times from 2 different locations? What's going to get us back up and running the fastest?
Well, and it sounds like prioritizing workloads becomes, significantly more important because now not only are the volumes of data larger, but the threat vectors are different and there's more of them. So you've got to understand, all right, if I'm hard down as a result of a cyber attack, for instance, what do I need to get back up first? And how do I make sure that that's the fastest, most reliable, easiest, workload to get back online? So it sounds like the prioritization, which again goes back to testing, is even more critical.
And if you think about the fact that, today your most important workload isn't your entire data set, right? It's a smaller subset of that data. Today you may be able to control it, but the reason why classification starts to become so important is, just like 5 years ago, that entire data set wasn't a lot and you could probably recover it. Today, that smaller data set might not be so big, but it's going to be pretty soon. And if you don't have good policies and practices in place to be able to do that type of recovery, you're going to be hurting in the long run.
And I think one of those policies also has to be making sure you're maintaining your offsite copies. If you're running reclamation, if you're expiring off the data as it's needed. Otherwise, you will have so much dead data and data that you don't need to bring back that's going to have to be skipped over and sorted through. That goes back to making sure your offsite copies are also in shape.
You don't want to waste cycles on recovering data that's unnecessary or expired or no longer relevant.
Or having to bring back more tapes than are necessary because they're only 10% full.
And Tricia, you started to talk about this before, but that 3-2-1 practice behind data protection or backup, right? 3 copies of your data, 2 media types, and 1 of those being offline, right? To get that full level of protection. Again, now you've got a massive amount of data, and now you're making 3 copies of it, right? Now data management and things like reclamation and where is that data going and how do I pull it back the fastest from what location, depending on what the disaster is, if it is a cyber hack or something, all play a part into, if you don't have a good understanding of your information and where it is, it could be catastrophic. It's funny. I think about the fact that over the course of time, the data protection administrator, once was a very, very important job. Now, through time, the applications have gotten simpler and easier to use and try to make this process easier. But now the disasters and the effects of what can happen when I have data loss are so paramount to the organization that I better have a good data protection administrator in my organization that can help me get my data back when I need it.
Well, and hasn't some of the data resiliency and data protection logic been pushed kind of closer to the edge, like more into the applications themselves in some cases? Especially a lot of ISV applications and workloads have embedded data protection, data security capabilities to maybe mitigate some of that back-end work. So again, this all, to me, as more of an outsider, sounds very complex, but I know that's the beauty of what the solutions do, is they make it easier to manage this kind of convoluted model.
I'm not sure I believe that. I think it is very very complex. It always has been and always will be.
Yeah.
I mean, when I start thinking about this stuff, go ahead.
I do buy that, because we used to have to talk a lot about BRMS, where you did bare metal restore of your operating systems. And I know that still occurs in some systems, but because so many of our applications are being put into virtual applications or containers, that changes I lost everything, not just a disk, I lost my entire machine. Yep. How rapidly can I get that entire operating system, networking, applications up and running?
And a lot of those models are clustered and or in a grid or a mesh architecture, right? So the probability of losing the whole thing is significantly reduced. So it creates, there are still challenges with data protection and recovery. It just kind of changes the complexion of those challenges, I guess. So yeah, Sean, you're right. I guess it's always going to be kind of
and that's the big risk, right? I mean, the famous grid architecture example is Microsoft and Active Directory, right? Who, from my understanding, used to advocate that you don't need a backup, right? You have 200 replicas of this Active Directory server. So if we lose one, you got 199 left. Mm-hmm. Well, what are the things that are, what is hackers attacking first? Active Directory servers, right? And replicating the corruption through 200 copies, right?
Yeah.
So
it's like using your most powerful tools against you. Yeah.
Right.
Great. So interesting conversation, folks. And I think it's important that a lot of our clients understand that as data continues to grow, they've got to have a lot of these things in place and really be thinking about this to ensure that they can recover their business in the case of a catastrophic event. Tricia, we're now at the time for your tool tip. You want to share with us your tool tip?
It's prop time. Yes.
I'm ready.
There we go.
So today's tool tip, Tricia's tool tip, I was actually going to pass it off to Sean because we've talked a lot about the YouTube videos and how that can be education, but we actually have a lot of classes and structured education that Sean does a lot of work on.
Production note, we're all going to need hard hats now, just in case this happens again. We need another handoff.
There we go.
So let me show you how to find some of this stuff from IBM. I'll just go to my browser here. And really the easiest way to do this is to Google IBM training. And when you do that, let's see, I have to spell it right, of course. You will find the IBM training site. And of course, IBM is a huge company with hundreds and probably thousands of products, and they probably have thousands of training courses available. But you can use the handy dandy search function to search for particular training, and particularly the products that Tricia and I work on a regular basis, Spectrum Protect. If you just go out there and search, you will find all of the courses that are available on there on Spectrum Protect and lots of other things. So as you can see, there are 26 badges, 12 certifications, 22 courses, 4 videos, and 6 mastery certifications. Now, with all of these, some of these are going to be very lengthy, perhaps 5-day courses, 3-day courses, 2-day courses that have hands-on labs. And there will be a cost associated with those, which you can click on this and get the cost. But there's also a significant number of courses out here that are also no cost. They tend to be shorter. They tend to be, more specific to particular subjects. So for instance, here is an introduction to Spectrum Protect, which is a no cost course. So you can get that. One of the things I just had up here was we just recently produced IBM Spectrum Protect Disaster Recovery course, which is no cost and kind of gives you some hints and tips and tricks on how to use Spectrum Protect DRM, which is useful if you're using tapes and trying to manage the truck that Randy is so
eager to
fond
have.
So eager to have, right? So that's some of the information out there. I would say, go out there and take a look, and I think you'll find some things that are really interesting. And of course, a lot of them are no cost, so you got nothing to lose, right?
Great, thanks for sharing that, Sean. I appreciate that. And it's nice to know that there are some obviously for cost, and I think a lot of those mastery courses, if you're trying to really harness those skills to become that professional for data recovery, you probably want to look at some of those. But it's nice that there are some that are no cost. And as you said, Sean, spend a couple hours, get to know the solution, understand if it's the right fit for your environment. I think it's great that there's that level of diversity.
Cool.
So this week, we also want to talk about what's in the news. And Randy, earlier this week, you and I had a nice call with Dennis Kennelly, our general manager, and Sam Warner, our vice president of offerings, around a new solution that IBM is offering called IBM Cloud Satellite, which kind of plays in that space similar to AWS Outpost sort of thing. You want to take us through what that is?
Yeah, sure. So this was a pretty cool announcement, and there's actually been some subsequent announcements and press around it, and a lot of analysts kind of checking in and kind of giving their opinions on it. So what Cloud Satellite is essentially is the ability to deploy cloud-like infrastructure on-prem. I mean, that's kind of the simple 30,000 foot view of the world. And like some of the things you mentioned, AWS Outpost, Microsoft Azure Stack, and others, the goal is really twofold. Number one, it's to build that seamless experience, that consistent experience between, the cloud offerings by the big public clouds, including now IBM's, and what you have in your data center. So it's managed the same, services are provisioned the same, monitored the same. It enables a lot of the same capabilities, and enables you to seamlessly transition the data and workloads either from on-prem to the cloud, depending on the use case, depending on the cost model, the particular requirements that you have. So it really builds that integrated experience and that consistent user experience. So it's, excuse me, it's pretty cool. From our perspective as a storage brand and as a systems brand, we're going to be developing a hyperconverged appliance, a hyperconverged infrastructure appliance that will be the sort of delivery mechanism for the on-prem solution of IBM Cloud Satellite. So we're kind of still in the process of naming, which is a whole, convoluted process in and of itself. But that's going to be available as well, and that's part of this IBM Cloud Satellite overall program. So it's kind of interesting in the sense that we're a little. I don't want to say we're a little late to the party. There have been other cloud providers who have launched similar solutions prior, obviously, as we've seen. Where I think it's differentiated, though, is I would argue, and I think you'll see that in some of the press and some of the reaction to it, when you look at the entire IBM Red Hat ecosystem, the full stack from data sitting on media somewhere, whether it's in your data center or at an edge data center or in a core public cloud data center, all the way out to edge devices, mobile devices, IoT instruments that are gathering data and streaming data, in an industrial application, for instance, sensor data. I would argue that our stack, the IBM Red Hat stack, is the only one in the industry that is genuinely fully integrated from top to bottom. Others are more piecemeal. They're more ecosystem plays. They're a little more complicated. There's more interoperability and integration work that has to be underwritten either by you as a consumer or by a third-party provider, an integrator, or an ISV. So I think we have a real good opportunity here to stake out a thought leadership position in this space. So I think this is a really important announcement, and I think 2021 is going to be a significant year for this kind of a solution. And I think IBM Cloud Satellite, again, is very well positioned to stake out that leadership position because of the maturity and interoperability and flexibility and open standards nature of that stack. So cool stuff. You can go out on the website and learn more about it. There's a lot of information on the IBM site, obviously. You can Google it. And again, you'll see a lot of the press reaction and the analyst reactions, which is pretty positive. And it very much dovetails into the broader IBM strategy. And the reason we spent, $34 billion for Red Hat is because we really want to be able to deliver that full stack solution, but do it in a way that doesn't lock our clients into a single vendor. It is, again, based on predominantly OpenShift, which is an open standards-based open source, project and initiative. So I think it has a lot to offer. It's going to be interesting to see, and I think 2021 is a big year for it. So pretty cool. And from the data protection and data resilience perspective, of course, there's huge implications here for, Tricia, what you were talking about earlier in terms of the ability to protect container data, serverless data, microservices-based workloads in this new environment. So pretty cool, pretty exciting, I think, and it's going to be a big year for this kind of a solution, I believe.
I'm glad you shared that with us, Randy. We'll put the link to the video that we did earlier this week in the notes and in the bottom here, so you can see that and get to it. And I like the fact that you talked about the data protection component as well. Recently, within Spectrum Protect Plus, we have done some work to support the OpenShift platforms, the open source OpenShift platforms, to be able to do better data protection of those environments. And so I agree with you. I think we're pretty integrated lockstep, and that makes it a lot easier for the clients to be able to deploy these types of solutions and feel like that they're protected. Yeah,
and that's another really important point is kind of ease of consumption and time to value or other elements of the solution, right? So if our clients are already consuming IBM Cloud Services or other public cloud services, and they want to have that same experience and that same ease of implementation and being able to make this infrastructure truly composable and programmable, this is a huge step in that direction.
Great. Okay, so another great addition. Tricia, any closing words with our large capacity recovery?
My closing word is actually around Randy's article, and he mentioned that IBM is really making steps with its Red Hat offerings, and with Spectrum Protect Plus, we've introduced a lot of protection options for that, and just watch that roadmap because we even have more coming.
Great. How about you, Sean? Closing words?
Classify, plan, and test. The three-legged stool, right?
And truck.
And truck.
Forget the
Well,
trucks.
I don't know so much about that.
All right, gang. I want to thank you all very much. I appreciate it, and we'll see you all next week.
Thanks, everybody.